Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to invite, if you didn't get a handout, you can get one in the back, and I'd invite you to take a look at it for a couple minutes. It might suggest where I'm going with this talk. 2-minute reading period. We can welcome. I want to thank Dr. Richard Gallardi, who's put together this series once again for us. He works years ahead on this, and organizing it all, so I appreciate that. And I'm speaking this evening about what we can learn from parishes that existed before the Second Vatican Council started in 1962, before that period. Now, for some people here, that will bring back memories, and it'll be familiar territory. And we do that not for nostalgic purposes, but so see if we can learn something from it about how we can make parishes better today. Now, there's some younger people here that's ancient history. It's Second Vatican Council's back there somewhere with Trent. It's lumped in the general category of in the past. So some of them are here. Well, some of them have to be here because they have to write a paper on it. But why would they want to be here? I don't know why. Except write a paper. No, I see this as a way of sort of bridging a gap. There's actually a book out. It's called Reclaiming Catholicism. It's edited by Thomas Groom and Michael Daly. I actually have a chapter in this book that I'm drawing on. But the purpose of the book was to help young people to know what we're talking about. So always talking about the pre-Vatican II church or something. So Tom Groom felt especially that they needed to have some way of knowing what that was about. That would be a valuable thing for them to know, and a way of understanding where they're at today. So there's all kind of articles in here about everything you can think of about the pre-Vatican II church. My chapter had to do with the parish. So one way of thinking of this is to bridge a gap between older generations and younger ones, so there would be maybe some at least common reference points, something that we're talking about in past history that some experience directly, but at least others know something about it. And of course, again, the whole point of this series and this lecture tonight is to say, what can we learn from that past and that great treasure storehouse? What can we bring forward into the future? Well, that's where I'm going with all this. So, and people who are into books, it tells you, it's got the name of this book and some other books that I drew on in doing this lecture. Those are mentioned in the introduction there. So, familiar territory for some, new for others. So it's going back to what the pre-Vatican II church. So I'm imagining a parish, St. Catherine's Parish. Well, that happens to be where I grew up, so in Toledo, and I'm imagining a family, and I'm calling them Bob and Kathy, and they belong to this parish, and they're in the 1950s. So the 50s, for the young people, that was the Eisenhower years. He ended up ending the Korean War, and it was time when things were pretty smooth, and nobody worried about their kids being on drugs and all of that. So that's sort of the background. And it was also a time when Catholics were making it in the culture. In other words, the GI Bill, if you want to know what's important in the history of Catholicism in the United States, there are few things that are more important than the GI Bill. What that did is let veterans coming back from World War II go to college. And by going to college, people got educations, and as a result, were able to get better jobs. And so then they moved out of the neighborhoods and moved into the suburbs. They built new parishes there, and so on. That is just so crucial for understanding how Catholicism went during that period. It was we moved into becoming more affluent people. We still were dealing with the nativist prejudice, but we were able to gradually move into the mainstream, signaled, of course, by the election of John Kennedy in 1960. Okay, so what's this parish look like now? Well, Kathy and Bob have 4 kids, and the parish is the center of their life. That's where they worship, that's where their kids get their sacraments, that's where they socialize, that's where they have dances there. They participate in all kind of activities of the parish. And one of the things they instill in their kids is a great respect for the priests. There's 4 priests serving in this parish. There's a pastor and these associates. And those priests for Bob and Kathy are on a pedestal. And even if the pastor drinks a little too much, that's fine. Nobody's really worried about that. No, so everything's cool with that. So, and they teach their kids to have this respect, and they see the priests as giving them the sacraments. They make Christ present on the altar. Oh, they baptize their children. They arrange for the confirmation. In fact, the priests do everything you can think of in the parish. The priests visit the sick. They take communion to the sick. They instruct converts one by one. Not in an RCA, not in a group. I remember when I was a young priest in '62, and I had this brilliant idea of instructing converts in groups. And the pastor clearly told me, you don't do that. You instruct them one by one. You don't have a group. One by one. Oh, okay. Got it. That really makes a lot of sense. So, and the priests, they celebrated the Mass, they ran the devotions, they did all the financial things, took care of everything. And the pastor was sort of a supreme authority. And of course, it's centered on the Mass. So, David, and I said Mass in the past, I said Mass back to the people, and I said it in Latin, and most of it was mumbled, so nobody could know what I was saying anyway. And there were all kind of interesting rituals connected with it. Those who served, I used to go up and I'd go over here and read the epistle, and afterwards, what would I do? Yes. Put out my hand, and the server would know that signal. He would come up and very solemnly get that book and come down to the center and bow or kneel, and then take it up to the other side where I would read the gospel in Latin. Nobody followed what was going on. Then on Sundays, and Bob and Kathy usually go to the 9 a.m. Mass on Sunday. It's a low Mass. They go there mainly because Bob likes Masses that are quick. And that is a quick Mass. There is no singing. There is no participation. We do read the epistle and gospel in English before I give this sermon that has nothing to do with the 2 readings. And often has a lot to do with make sure you contribute more in the collection. So, and Bob, what he most likes about the Mass is when he can be an usher. Because then, when it's time for the sermon, he goes out and gets a smoke. Unfortunately, when the Holy comes, the Sanctus comes, they ring a bell so he knows when to come back in. Oh. Now and then, Kathy, she likes more high Mass, but she goes to the low Mass, please her husband. But sometimes she takes the kids to the high Mass. Now, that Mass, they have a wonderful choir and they sing beautiful Gregorian chant. And the Mass takes a lot longer. It's more solemn. And when they have a really solemn high Mass, then they have incense. And the bells ring during the consecration. And it creates for Kathy and for her kids a great sense of mystery, of being close to God, of God being the transcendent one. And she likes to do that. Getting their kids through the sacrament is very important. And in fact, as soon as she gave birth to her kids, they baptized them as soon as possible. For her first 2 kids, she wasn't even there. Baptized them Sunday afternoon. She was still recovering and wasn't even there for the baptism of her children. And then they had confirmation and so on. And Kathy took great pride in her parish. They used to have 40 hours. When they'd have 40 hours, then the priests would come from all over. And she was part of the Altar and Rosary Society. And their job was to keep the church looking good. That was the one time they could go past the communion rail and go up around the altar when they were cleaning. And she loved that. She loved the priests to come and to see their beautiful church, and she was so proud of that. And serving on the Altar and Rosary Society was a good thing. She made a lot of her friends that way and so on. Her husband, he was in the Holy Name Society, and they used to sponsor communion breakfasts. So on Sunday, once a month, they would have go to the Mass, and he would his sons would come with him, and afterwards they'd go into the parish hall and have breakfast, and they would have a speaker that would come, be part of that. And one of the things they never missed was the parish mission. Once a year, there was a priest would come in, usually a Paulist or Redemptorist, always a religious order priest, would come in and give fiery talks and inveighing against impurity and drunkenness, major sins of the Catholic people. And he would promote out of all of this, he would promote sort of a sense of, really good, solid Catholic guilt. And there would then be the opportunity for confessions after this. The confessions lines were long. In fact, at the parish, St. Catherine's, on Saturday afternoon, 4 priests were hearing confessions, and they'd be in there about 4.5 hours on a Saturday. And people would be coming in regularly throughout. Many of them sort of made up sins because they didn't have much chance to sin during the last week. They were just there last week. So I had to figure out what they're going to say in the confessional. There was an awful lot of impure thoughts that occurred in a 1-week period. I mean, you could have many, many impure thoughts in a 1-week period. So that the confession lines were long. The priests spent all the time doing that and so on. It was the center of the social life for the people. Bob Bold in the Parish League, and with all of his buddies, and they'd have their beer frames, and it's a great social time. And Kathy Bold with women in the Women's Bowling League also. And they used to come to the parish for dances periodically and so on. So that's, I probably didn't, for our young people, the reminder that Mass that they had, that quickie Mass, in fact all of them, they didn't have things like you're so familiar with. Like there was no prayer of the faithful, and there was no greeting of peace. There was no participation in the chalice. Many of the things that are just so familiar to us today simply didn't exist. And the priest, again with his back, turned around periodically and said, Dominus vobiscum. Thank you. See, the Catholic faithful were literate in Latin. It's amazing. There was a special relation with the priest. The priest used to bowl with the men on some nights and so on, and that was always a special time. And it was special when the priest would stop in the house. Every year, one of the priests in the parish visited the home. And if it was, they just moved in, he had a blessing of the home and so on. And it was a chance to chat and talk. They did it every year. Stopped into every home in the parish and visited. And when the pastor came, they had dinner for the pastor. That was really special. It didn't happen real often. Now, Bob was also appointed by the pastor to be like a councilman, or maybe even a trustee. And that his job was to sign the official financial records that occurred once a year. Now, that usually took place in this fashion. He and the other one, there were two of them, were invited over to the rectory, and they had dinner and had a few drinks and so on. And at the end of dinner and before the dispersing, the pastor brought out this piece of paper and they signed it. They had actually never read the financial report, or they had no idea what was going on in it, but they signed this paper as the official trustees or the official councilman of the parish and so on. Well, that's some flavor maybe of what the Vatican II parish was all about. It was, as you can tell, strongly clerical. I mean, the priest did everything. All the ministries you could think of, the priest did them. And the lay people were relatively passive. And that's where it gave us that line, what was the job of the laity? To pay, pray, and obey. One of the things that was true in that time was they studied the Baltimore Catechism. And Kathy really trusted the nuns. In the whole school, sisters taught in every grade. There were mercy sisters who taught in every grade. And in every grade, you did the same thing. You studied the Baltimore Catechism. The Baltimore Catechism was written in 1885. It actually had 421 questions. Some people might know that. 421 questions, and the religious education was all about memorizing those answers. It was very effective. I'll prove it. What is a sacrament? Is that impressive, David? Could we do that? I got my students here. My students, we study theology, right? We've had a whole class on sacramentology. If I asked you to, what is a sacrament, would all of you sitting there have in unison an answer? No. No. Wouldn't. What was the first question? Why did God make you? It's amazing. It's amazing. So that's a parish, a typical parish. There was a St. Vincent de Paul Society. Yes, that was probably the most active thing that happened. St. Vincent de Paul. St. Vincent de Paul Society took care of helping the poor, and so on. And it was, they did an awful lot of good. We still have that today, St. Vincent de Paul Society. All right. Now, it's obvious that after the Second Vatican Council, things changed. So some people in the room come here to worship at Corpus Christi, and others would know the same thing. We know that liturgy. The altars in the center are all gathered around, and we got like ushers and lectors and Eucharistic ministers. And in the parish, you have people who help instruct the young people in preparing for marriage. We have a whole RCIA program that runs, from September to the Easter Vigil. And we got all kind of different people who teach in it, and so on. And the role of the priest just is so different. People take communion to the sick. You know, in our parish, when someone's ill, people come forward and they take care of them. There's just a general sense that the lay people are involved in the church and have a responsibility. You know, if there's one thing out of Vatican, when I say Vatican II, that's the 21st Ecumenical Council from 1962 to 65, which students produced how many documents? 16, very good. See, they know that. They can't give me a definition of the sacrament, but they know the Second Vatican Council, and they know other things about the council, although it's historical, but they know things that the council wanted us to learn. They have a general sense that in liturgy you participate. I never see any of our young people come in and say the rosary during Mass. You might say it before, but not during. You look around our young people who come to Mass, they sing. They got that in their bones and blood. You're not just there as a spectator. It's all about participation. Sing in the choir. They know they're supposed to play a role. They get up and read the scriptures and so on. They've got that. They don't have a definition of the sacrament. They don't know that first question out of the catechism. They know that ecumenical dialogue's an important thing. They know we should have good relationships with our Protestant brothers and sisters. They know that interfaith dialogue is a helpful thing. They know that being a Catholic has got to do with working for justice and peace. So there is stuff. They know they are the church. And they are responsible for the church. You know, they have to participate in that church. That's in their minds and hearts. You might ask how that's happened, and it's maybe a complex process, but that is what has happened. So Vatican II they know that they're called to holiness. They know that priests aren't, the holy ones. And they probably got a pretty good sense of having lived through the sex abuse crisis, disabused. The priests have been pulled off the pedestal by circumstances. They know that. And they have to find another way to think about priests and how to interact with them. They know often some history that we've had some pretty lousy popes, and they have to deal with that history, so on. So we're in a mode of a new kind of parish, and the pastor functions in a different way. We had a staff meeting one day, and I said something like, I don't know half of what's going on around here, and one of our staff members said, no, it's more like 20%. Which would be probably pretty accurate. I mean, in the old days, the pastor, no pastor would ever say that. The pastor knew everything that was going on, had control over everything that was going on. My theory is if you don't know what's happening, you can't try to control it. That's my theory of pastoring. If you don't know what's happening, then somebody else will be running it. So a pastor could be thought of in terms of as a servant leader, as someone who's trying to empower others. So the number of shifts that have occurred, so laity have moved from being passive members of the community to being very active. We have lay ecclesial ministry today. So we're not just coming into Mass, but we're actually participating in it. There's even people who are interested in the homily. We don't call them sermons anymore, we call them homilies, because they're supposed to deal with the readings of the Mass. And there's actually Catholics who come expecting to hear something. There's an expectation that something good could happen that way. So we got all of these shifts here. We've moved from a strong devotionalism before, that the medals, the scapulars, the devotion to St. Jude, all the different saints that were so big. The Catholic immigrant piety was devotional. That's where the emotion came in. That's where the passions were. I remember the pastor I served in at first. he didn't get too much emotional about anything except the sorrowful mother devotions on Thursday evening, which he insisted on taking. He had me take all the baptisms, but he's taking the sorrowful mother devotions. And I could tell that grabbed him, that it touched him in a way that, frankly, liturgy didn't. You know, so it was a highly devotional kind of piety that was there. And what was fostered was a tremendous sense of loyalty. You know, the people who belonged to St. Catherine's Parish were proud of that. They tolerated those people over in St. Agnes, you know. But that's where it was. And a lot of that grew up out of sports. You know, what happened, the boys were playing sports in the parish, and CYO basketball, CYO football, and everything, all kind of sports for the boys. The girls had no outlet that way. Girls could be cheerleaders for the boys. There are probably special moments in school plays they could involve themselves in that, or one of them would be chosen to be the May Queen. She would crown the Blessed Virgin Mary and so on. And the boys, of course, could serve Mass. I was reading in that book, Reclaiming Catholicism, some of the writers there are priests, and they're saying how their vocation was fostered by serving Mass. They remember how important in 5th grade, started serving Mass, they learned to pray, Confiteor Deo, Omnipotenti. You could probably do that one too. So, good. The girls weren't allowed to do that. You know? So we see a shift in a lot more women being involved in the parish than before. Okay, so we got contrast. Now, how are we to think about that? What are we supposed to do with that? Now, I want to offer some what I call sort of larger perspectives on it all. The first I'm calling Reform the Reform. Now, what has happened is at the Second Vatican Council, in almost every big vote on the new things, religious liberty, divine revelations, there was always a group of about 50 negative votes. There'd be 2,300 in favor and 55 against. It happened consistently throughout the council. Those people against were largely people who worked in the Vatican, bishops, cardinals in the Vatican, and in the curial offices. Now, those people were not going to go down without a fight. That was their turf, that's their world, that's their church. You know, and that minority and their heirs have continued their efforts to turn back the council, to go back to the way it was before the council. It's under the rubric of Reform the Reform, and under the heading of Continuity versus Discontinuity. This is a language that comes out of the Vatican all the time. Second Vatican Council didn't introduce much new. It's mostly just a continuation of what was before. So all the disputed questions come back into play in terms of continuity. That's what the council's all about. And so, Reform the Reform tries in many ways to get back to the clericalism that we knew before the council that was existing in those parishes. So we got examples of that. And when I'm at Mass now, the lay people used to come up and get the ciboria and the cups for the wine, take it off the altar and go distribute. No more. I must hand it to them. After Mass, it's the priest's job has to wash up the vessels. Only the priest is allowed to do that. We have at the Masses that Pope Benedict has in the Vatican, people cannot receive in their hand. They must receive on their tongue. There's a lot of things being floated about the priest turning his back to the people again and celebrating Mass like that, facing the east. So there's a whole thing going on under the heading of Reform the Reform. And I think the current visitation of the sisters in the United States probably fits right into that general rubric of the sisters have renewed themselves too much somehow, or they're out of line and have to be reined in, brought back to more like it was before the Second Vatican Council. Do you remember when Teresa Kane challenged Pope John Paul II here? To the Vatican people, that was just impossible. I mean, it's unthinkable. It wasn't wrong or anything. It's just unthinkable that a Catholic sister in public would somehow question the Pope. You know, so this mindset of the minority and their heirs at the council, you know, is we're going to win it back. We're here all the time. Well, we're going to straighten this thing out. So that's one, it seems to me, one of the large dynamics that's going on when we can compare what was going on in the 1950s and what's going on now. It's like rein it in. Like get it back more like it was before. And a lot of times there's the feeling of clericalism. Now, there's a second kind of thing, that large perspective that I would offer in thinking about how to deal with that difference between the two parishes. And that is, for a lot of people, it is a sort of a matter of a nostalgia for how that was before. A nostalgic thing. That is, that church, it was so beautiful, so filled with mystery. The devotions touched me in many ways, and I want to keep them alive. And we do that. Now, right in our parish, had a great example of this. We had a novena last year for in favor of peace and so on. The novena is one of those traditional practices, 9 days. And the guts of the novena was saying the rosary. Now, I found it fascinating to see the positive reactions to that. Very positive reactions. There were people who I know are, love the church and the Second Vatican Council, haven't done a novena for decades, and don't say the rosary anymore, and have set aside all those devotions. And they told me personally how much they got out of that novena centered on saying the rosary. So there is one part of looking back at that devotional life there of the church that people want to hang on to, people who experienced it. Now we got another group going on, people who never experienced that, but somehow find it fascinating. Somehow they're taken with it. So we have young priests in the diocese who want to now dress like we used to dress. Wear a cassock, surplice, beretta. It was a hat. David, that was a hat. Only hat. Beretta. Who want to do that, who in their language will talk about sounds a lot like the clericalism that we knew in the past. And part of their dominant set and mindset is that the older priests messed it up, that this whole Vatican II reform went too far, and that we really hurt the church, and that their own mission in life as a priest is to get it back to how it was, to overcome these big mistakes and errors that have gone on since the Second Vatican Council. We have our young people here, right, at Corpus Christi University Parish, that we keep alive that devotional life. So we have students who say the rosary before Mass. We've had students who have consecrated themselves to the Blessed Virgin Mary, like women used to do in the past. One day in my class, one of my students brought in a scapular for all the other students in the class to wear, with an explanation of what a scapular was all about. We have adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. We have an interest in benediction. I'm talking about students, all of that going on. So, my second main large perspective is that there is some connection with that life of the parish as it was known in the past. Let me try another one. It's from one of the books in your thing there. One of the authors is the Jesuit Pederet. And what they did, studied the sisters before Second Vatican Council. And their thesis and theory is that it was the sisters, members of religious orders, who gave the vitality to those parishes in the 40s, 50s, and so on, that they were responsible for it. And what they studied is, how did they do it? How did they make this happen? Because at that time, they produced something like a 70% Mass attendance. 70% of Catholics went to Mass every Sunday. Today, what it would be. In Australia, I think it's 14%. In the United States, it might be pushing high 20s. Now that's an amazing thing. So they studied, how did they do it? And they came up with 4 strategies that the sisters used in order to make this happen. And the strategy was, first of all, they had a compelling story of what it meant to be Catholic and how that involved one in regular and weekly Mass attendance. So a lot of people in the room know that story. The story is, that's what Catholics do. That Mass is at the center of our lives. It's the church law that you have to go. That's the way you please God, by going. And if you don't go, it's a mortal sin. And if you don't confess that, you're going to end up going to hell. That was the compelling story, roughly, that was at work and produced a 70%, helped to produce a 70% Mass attendance. The other thing they identified in that book is that they had clear norms. There was nothing up for grabs. It was a very clear thing. This is what Catholics do. If you're a Catholic, you make First Communion in 2nd grade. If you're a Catholic, you go to confession once a week or maybe every other week. If you're a Catholic, you go to Mass every Sunday. So there were it was clear, absolute clear norms that everyone knew what to follow. The other thing that they were able to do was they introduced practices that all Catholics did, and as a result, they would they sort of produced a Catholic identity. So that when you went into church, you dipped in the font, made the sign of the cross. Before you went in your pew, you genuflect, then you went in your pew. After you were in your pew, you knelt down and prayed for a while. When you wrote a paper or a letter, somebody wrote JMJ on the top. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. When you went by a church, you bowed. When women came to church, they had to wear a hat, had to have a head covering. When men passed the church, they would tip their hat. So there's hundreds of these things, practices, that all revolved around this, getting this sense, this is what Catholics are, this is what Catholics do. Part of it was great devotion to Mary. So the May crowning was crucial. That was often big ceremonies surrounding the crowning of Mary in May. And as I said, one person would be chosen to, one woman would be chosen to do that. Even in colleges at that time, they often had elaborate rituals around that. People said the rosary at the funeral home. That's, you knew when you went to the funeral home for the wake, you said the rosary. That was a standard thing that went on. So they surrounded all of this with these very clear Catholic practices. One of those was that you had to fast from midnight before you went to communion the next day. That's why Bob wanted to go to 9 o'clock Mass, because he waited till 11. He was starving to death. Wouldn't eat for Mass. So that was very clear, and it created a Catholic identity. You know, we were at a party on Saturday night. Catholics stopped eating it and drinking at midnight, except for those liberals who went by sun time and said you could wait till 12:24. 12:24, wasn't it? That's when a lot of us stopped, you know. No more beers after 12:24. So there was this fasting thing before communion. These are all practices. Abstaining all the Fridays of Lent, you know, and fasting during Lent. So, and then the other thing the sisters did, the fourth thing, was they showed there was a benefit from doing all this. The major benefit was you were going to get to heaven, but it also helped you in many other ways. Helped you to be a better person. It helped you to fight against those terrible temptations in the world. You know, especially purity matters. So on. Drinking. Okay, that was my third major perspective. I better get with it here. Another one of my major perspectives I get from my teacher, Karl Rahner. He's the guy back there facing the font with the book, stern-looking fellow, one of the great theologians in all of the history of the Catholic Church. Privileged to have spent time with him and so on. Rahner's large take on this is that all of that effort to reform the reform is doomed to failure. That it's totally anachronistic. That his take on the Second Vatican Council isn't that it was the culmination of a lot of different movements, liturgical, theological, ecumenical, and John the 23rd up there pulled it all together. He thinks it's absolutely wrong. He says that the Second Vatican Council was the tiny, tiny beginning of the second great change in the history of the Church. And that is that the church would become a world church for the first time. And it would be decentralized. And there would be national hierarchies would have great power. And the liturgy would be enculturated in Africa and China and all over the world. Rahner felt that that was an inevitable movement in the church. And that all of the centralizing stuff coming out of the Vatican, all the reform would be seen to be totally anachronistic, totally against the flow of what is the Second Vatican Council unleashed, so that it would be seen as a great power source. And the power directions are in terms of empowering people, enculturation, so on. It would be impossible to have one canon law to run that whole church. That there would be more and more power put in the hands of national hierarchies. So I offer that again as a perspective point on what is on how we're dealing with what we're learning from this experience of Bob and Kathy at St. Catherine's Parish. And finally, in the large perspective points, is that the idea that seems to me the way to go about this is to reappropriate the wisdom from that time and to put it into a new framework, a new theological framework, by and large given to us by Vatican II. This is the opposite of just rejecting and say, that's all old-fashioned, that's all out, who cares about it, forget it, thank goodness it's over, thank goodness we're beyond it. That's one extreme. The other extreme would be is like we see among some people, to go back and live like that and redo it. The problem with that is, Scott Appleby from Notre Dame gave a talk here that I was very taken by, said he was describing this movement among many young Catholics and so on. He said the problem is it's not organic. It's like sitting on top of something. You're in a whole other culture, a whole other world, and here you're walking around in a cassock and surplice. He said, it doesn't fit. Now, when we did that back then, it was part of the whole culture. It was organic. It's just, that's the way it was. You see the difference? It's like putting something on top, sitting there, without any rootage, without any context. That's a really important point. I'm not saying that as well as I'd like to, but I can feel it. There's no solidity to it. There's no vital organic connection. So I'm saying this reappropriating, what I want to do is look at all what was neat and good about all of that and say, how would we do it? What would we learn from that? How would we do it in today's world? So I'm isolated. I probably could isolate a lot more things. Let's see here. The first is the whole idea of Catholic identity. Bob and Kathy knew what it was to be Catholic. Their kids knew it. It was in their bones and blood. There was no doubt about it. There was the Baltimore Catechism teaching, and this is what we were. We're the people that had devotion to Mary, and we celebrated St. Patrick's Day, and we wore medals and scapulars. That's what we did. That's what we were. Now that's broken down. You can talk to our young people. That's broken down. It isn't there anymore. So the question becomes, can we use a strong Catholic identity? I think yes. I think they had something that was valuable. Or we had something that was valuable, the people who lived through it. And we need that thicker Catholic identity today. Now, where are you going to get that? Well, my sense is we're going to get it by emphasizing the essentials. It can't be based on a scapular or writing JMJ on the top of a paper. No, it's got to be connected in, it seems to me, with what the essentials of Catholicism are all about. And overarching all of that is a sacramental sense of life. That's our genius as Catholic people. It's an incarnational sense of life. That is, that the infinite God is present in the finite world. The great mysterious God comes and is present in trees and in nature and in other people, in communities, in the efforts to do good in the world. No, that's what we get out of the Mass. So the Mass keeps telling us the infinite God who is revealed in Jesus Christ is present in the simplest things, that is sharing a meal of bread and wine. And it gives us that sacrament. It has to be rooted in that. I think it has to be rooted in a sense of the long tradition of the Church. That we are the heirs of Mary Magdalene and Oscar Romero, Thomas Aquinas and Teresa of Avila. That all of that's part of our tradition. Doesn't start in the 16th century or anything. It's our burden. It's a crummy history in many ways, but it's our history. It's a checkered history. There's a lot of grace in that, a lot of good things. But we have to have that sense of tradition. It has to have some sense that it's valuable to have a spokesperson for the Christian community. And if we're going to choose somebody to do that, historically that would be the Bishop of Rome. the one we call the Pope. That's somehow good. I mean, we might not like what he says or what he did or how he dresses or where he lives or 100 other things, but that somehow it is a good thing for us to have a focal point of unity, to have someone to go to the UN and say, no more war. That Catholic sensibility, that's a good thing to have. And part of this, where I want this Catholic identity, is rooted in this. We're part of a communion of saints. And Mary is part of that. We have a statue of Mary back there. So Mary is a key figure that we see what the scriptures say about her, and that she's important in our devotions and was important before and remains important to our young people as well. And another rock bottom, solid thing is our positive sense of human nature. That reason is a good thing, that philosophy is a good thing, that we have nothing to fear from science, that there's a fundamental goodness in human nature. So that's part of the way that I want to found this whole Catholic identity thing here. How are we going to foster that? Now, it seems to me there's two major ways to do that. One is good liturgy. It's so important that the liturgy is good. And liturgy is good if the music is good. No, my students, I did this. We said, well, what's most important to you about the Mass and coming to Mass? I think it was 11 out of 12 that said the music. I clearly noted that no one person said the homily. I reported this to our music minister as data that he might be interested in. However, despite that group of 12 who had an off night, weren't as sharp as they should have been. The preaching is important, and so is the presiding. That is where we're going to pass this on. So liturgy, it's got to be good. Parish liturgy's got to work. It's got to be participative. The music's got to be good. Presiding has to be welcoming. Preaching has to be relevant to people's lives. And the second thing that's going to create this is Christian service projects. We're seeing this more and more. The people who go on Christian service projects, they go to Honduras and spend a week with a medical team and meet the people there and try to learn the language or see how people live in the rest of the world, who try to give of themselves. They know that at the core of Catholic identity is the call to work for peace and justice in the world. So we're called not just to holiness, we're called to service. Discipleship involves good citizenship. It involves doing the works of justice and peace. That's an identity that we have to form. Can we do it as easily as the sisters did it before? I don't think so. But in every parish, that's the call. Let me do a couple more of these. What else do I want to do here? Loyalty. Bob and Kathy are totally loyal to St. Catherine's Parish. So are their kids. That's it. We've lost it entirely. We've got no loyalty left among our young people. That's true. I mean, people shop for another parish. They don't like this parish. They don't like the priest there or whatever. They shop for another parish. In the larger world, we've had people come out of our programs here who love coming here. They never miss Mass and so on. They move to a town. Catholic Church is cold. They don't like it. They're raising kids. The Presbyterian Church has got a great program for youth. They go there. I remember a young woman I dealt with who wanted to become a priest and couldn't become a Catholic. She was a Catholic and all her life. And product of our parish and so on, and she's now an Episcopalian in the seminary, studied to be an Episcopalian priest. My only point along this line, if we're going to, loyalty is a good thing. We should have loyalty. Josiah Royce is a great philosopher of loyalty in the United States. You want to read more about it. The great importance of loyalty in life for all of us. Loyalty to a marriage partner, loyalty to our communities, loyalty to the parish. It's very important to full living, but we got to earn it. You have to earn that loyalty. And how do we earn it? We earn it by the parish utilizing the talents of people, bringing people on board, empowering people to be involved. That's great in our parish. We have these pairing groups where the permanent community members interact with the students. That's a wonderful thing. Use that. And the second thing is the parish has to meet spiritual needs. Now, I know people who have moved away from here, and they write all the time in emails how we miss the parish. I love the parish. I miss it. There was a loyalty created. I know it can be done. We got people in this assembly who don't want to move because they don't want to be away from Corpus Christi Parish. Now, I'm putting us forward as perfect parish or anything, and we got our faults and all our problems, but I know there's people like that, and I know what the dynamics are. They were spiritually fed here. They felt it. They were involved. They did things. They worked for justice or peace or took care of the sick, so on. Lastly, the devotional life in parish. What do we do with that? My general sense of that is that, and we try to do that here. So we have adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. And people say the Rosary before Mass. We have Stations of the Cross and so on. We get ashes on Ash Wednesday, which is really interesting. It's our biggest attendance all year. It's not this is so instructive. It's not a holy day of obligation, but the young people come. Millsdale had 250 people at 10 p.m. last Ash Wednesday. We had 4 masses. We need to take that devotional life, that stuff of the past, and don't throw it away, but integrate it into a larger theological framework, a theological framework that makes sense for us today. So, we can take the Marian devotions of all kinds, nothing would be ruled out, and see that in terms of what Vatican II told us, Mary is the model of discipleship. She's the exemplar of what a follower of Jesus is all about. So I don't care what you do. You have a May crowning, you have a rosary, whatever you want to do, you could put it into that kind of framework. You can take all the Eucharistic adoration and show how it flows out of the liturgy. I use an example that abstaining was anything. We had people in our parish who during Lent, they abstained all through Lent, abstained from meat all through Lent. And what was the rationale? Take care of the environment. So you don't have to cut down more of the Amazon forest, and so to give more beef so we can buy hamburgers. Oh, that was their sense of how they would be involved in all of that. So you took a traditional practice of abstinence and reintroduce it. We could. I've thrown out the idea of Lent being more like Ramadan, getting back to a stronger sense of Lenten fasting. I was with one of the Muslims when they broke the Ramadan fast at his home. It was just powerful. And and it gets in the news, and it's in. Everyone's Ramadan. That's how Lent used to be for us. My sense is we should resurrect that. Find a way to make Lent that kind of thing again for us Catholic people. So that's all about reappropriation. That's my sense, and you could do other things with the mystery that was in the Mass and so on, but at least those ideas, reappropriating them, see what was of value, make it our own, use our imaginations to see how we could do them today, and do it in some sort of imaginative way that makes it integrated and not just sitting on the top of our heads. So St. Catherine's was a great place. I grew up there. I grew up there. I have happy memories of it. But Corpus Christi is a great place too. And it's got its own kind of vitality and its own energy and its own sense of what it means to be Catholic. I want to celebrate that as well. Let's take a couple of minute break and then we'll...
Just a quick comment.
I had some interesting comments during the break. I have to correct myself. The girls did play basketball at St. Catherine's High School. They played down in Westminster Gym, in their smaller gym. I stand corrected. Women had full rights. Westminster Gym, in the small gym down there. Others are nodding their heads. They know this to be true. I accept that. And I was also reminded that a whole lot of what created Catholic identity was the fact that the nativist prejudice and the fact that we were excluded from so many other things forced us into creating an identity. That's why we had no divisions in those days. All Catholics had to hang together because we had signs down in the docks in Toledo, no Irish need apply. Yeah, we have people in our parish who remember those signs. No Irish need apply. So we were dealing with the nativist prejudice, and it created a sense of identity. Just like our Muslim friends today in this culture, the distinction between Shias and Sunnis is sort of pales when you're trying to hang together as a minority group in another society. I think a lot of Catholics first knew anything of dissent came from William Buckley in 1961, when Mater et Magistra, Pope John the 23rd published that, and Bill Buckley had that famous column with the headline, Mater si, Magistra no. I believe that for many Catholics, it was the first time they knew there was any division within the church, that somebody would actually dissent from, and it came from the right, which is interesting, Bill Buckley, and came from the right in saying that, he was dissenting from the church, Pope John the 23rd's teaching, which he thought was too socialistic, which might have a familiar ring. You had questions? We have microphones for people, which seems to be helpful. And probably will alternate, and when you're finished, you'll probably find somebody else over here who wants to use it.
I have 2 points. One, you talked about the unity in Catholics. But when you and I were growing up, like in Sandusky, they had a Catholic high school with St. Mary's. The kids from Peter and Paul couldn't go.
Yep.
With just St. Mary's. In fact, I had an uncle who had 7 daughters. Didn't want them. His youngest son they wanted because he played football. He was a good football player.
Yes, sports rule the world. I don't know, Pat, I don't know if you knew that or not.
My uncle
sports are important.
He said, you can make your choice. He said, you weren't worried about my daughter's Catholic education. And
he became important because he played football.
The other thing I wonder is the communion. When you and I were serving, early masses, you had quite a few go to communion. Each mass, less and less.
Communion. Yeah.
Now, since
speak louder and right into the mic.
Since we,
I should have reminded him.
Since we eliminated the fast, almost everybody goes to communion.
Yeah.
I wondered what your thought on that was.
Yeah, well, let's first of all go back to the St. Mary's. That's where I was first assigned as a priest, and remember well all of that. And almost all Catholics of a certain age remember the ethnic rivalries. My mother went to St. Peter and Paul's parish in town here. That was the German parish. The Irish went to Immaculate Conception, Derby. And there was often not a lot of love lost between those. Someone came up to me during the break and said, well, I was from St. Agnes. So there was often rivalries like that, and ethnic rivalries, and national parishes that were important, and they served the immigrants, and they needed that because they needed cohesion, they needed support. It was a rough world. The nativist prejudice was powerful, and they needed to have like-minded people to be with. So I know that was the case in Sandusky, that we had St. Mary's. Now they have a central high school there, and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears went into making that happen. So your observation is right, and any full analysis of this would have to do ethnic parishes and the role that they played and so on. Also probably have to distinguish rural parishes from the way it was in urban areas. I forgot the other point.
Communion of the Vatican.
Yeah, communion, yes. Well, as you know, the long history of this is that Catholics stopped going to communion in any large numbers. Back in the 14th century, for example, Catholics hardly ever went to communion, but they came for the elevation. In fact, that's why they rang the bells. The big thing was to look, to see the Eucharist, not to receive it. And that worked its way all the way down into the 20th century. It was often couched in terms of, well, I'm not worthy to go. I can't go to communion unless I went to confession real soon, close by, because there might be a lot of impure thoughts that happened in that period, or maybe impure actions that happened, that would cause problems. So that was connected to see. That was a lot of what was behind ringing the bells, so you could see it. And even in the Eastern churches, that became a problem. They had the iconostasis that blocked off the people's view of the altar with all the icons on it. And to know when the elevation was coming, which was the important part, holding it up, so people could see it, they'd ring the bells. And I think it was also connected in with fasting. It was easier to go at 9 or 7 or 8 or 9 and have breakfast afterwards than it was to fast till noon or something. So that's probably a problem. But what we've seen, of course, is a great development in Vatican II is the idea that we're called upon to participate. And the way we participate is one of the ways is sharing in communion and in sharing in the cup as well. In one sense, we finally caught up with Luther's ideas that the cup for the people, that was one of the rallying cries of the Reformation, the cup to the people. So Second Vatican Council, we finally caught up with that, which is how it ought to be. And so frequent communion, it's just taken for granted now. And it's changed. Now, some people would say, well, people become so frequent, people don't take it seriously anymore. So you could have a pendulum swing. People don't think about, are they ready to receive, or their soul is open, or whatever, how you want to phrase it. So it would have its own kind of problems as well. Over here, yeah.
I wanted to say something more, ask something more about the Catholic identity business. It seems to me that 40 plus years ago, Catholics had an identity that was very strong in terms of doing things that only Catholics did. There were all kinds of these rituals and practices that only Catholics did. Catholic identity that you spoke of, which seems to me to be much more in depth and about much more substantial things, like the sacredness of life and the importance of justice and peace and working with the poor, and those practices are much more profound and significant. But, and this is where I'm not sure where I'm going with this, on the one hand it seems to be a positive thing in that it's so much deeper, but it also seems to be a problem in that those those are values that don't just belong to the Catholics.
No. Yes, Dave, thank you. Am I still on here? That's, I mean, wonderful comment, I think, and right on target. It just is harder today. If you're going to try to work at Catholic, why does that sound like it isn't on? Okay. You're going to work at Catholic identity today. It's more nebulous, as you well pointed out. You know, that to say that we have a sacramental sense of life. Well, I think I know what that means, and I do think we all share it, but it's harder to pin down or to say what it is. It's not as clear-cut as saying, well, we don't eat after midnight on Saturdays. That's neat. We all got it down. This is increasing our problem of creating the Catholic identity. One way I believe that we can think about it is that to stress what I call the Catholic imagination. In other words, we're not going to get people who know a definition of the sacraments. It isn't going to happen for a lot of reasons, because there's pluralism in theology, and because there's different catechetical approaches, and there's different ways of saying what sacraments are, and it's hard to pin down. That isn't going to happen. But the Catholic identity is going to be more in terms of our imagination, what I call our religious sensibilities. And that's what I think we have to play up, and I think we've got more of it than we think. In other words, I believe the young people that I deal with do have a sacramental sense of life, an incarnational sense, and fundamentally meaning that God, the infinite God, is present in the most finite, ordinary things. You can find God in the bedroom and in the kitchen and in the workplace and on the golf course. Well, that's hard, but I mean, it's so I think they've got that. So in one sense, I might say that we've got more Catholic identity than we recognize. And that would put me in a position of saying a lot of the people who are talking about Catholic identity, what they're really talking about is reform the reform and wanting to go back, and I don't want to do that. So I think I want to play up what's already there and then to try to solidify it. That's why you notice my two things for achieving it are liturgy. Liturgy produces an incarnational sense just by what we do. The infinite God through Christ is present in bread and wine. I mean, it gets into your thought patterns. It gets into your imagination, willy-nilly, whether you want it to happen or not. And the other thing of the Christian service projects is, again, that it becomes a way of being. That's what Catholics do. You go to Honduras and interact with the people, and I see the poor, and I now know for the rest of my life that I've got to be concerned with the less fortunate. So I think this is happening and will happen precisely to the degree we're good at those two things. That's why in Corpus Christi, this is a great initiative now. We were trying to get Christian service projects for more and more people. So a wonderful thing, members of our permanent community took one of our students down to Honduras for a week with a medical team and paid for the student to go. And I'm thinking, boy, there's a bonding. That's something that's really good, and it will shape that religious imagination. You had a follow-up, Dave. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that